Continuing debate, the honourable member for Battle River Crowfoot.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Thank you. And as always, it is an honor to be able to rise in this place to talk about the issues that are so important to the people that I represent in Battle River Crowfoot across east central Alberta, but also to ensure that the voices of Canadians are heard within this place. And certainly when it comes to the amount of correspondence, calls, people that will come up to me in the grocery store or on the street or walk into my office on Main Street Camrose, or when I chat with them across the many communities that I represent in Battle River Crowfoot, time and time again, I hear from constituents who share their concern, who share their dismay at the fact that this government, the fact that these Liberals and this Prime Minister would perpetuate a type of censorship that would limit the ability for Canadians to express themselves online. And Mr. Speaker, it is unbelievable that in the 21st century that would happen in Canada, yet we are seeing it now not only through Bill C-11, but we saw this through the previous Parliament's Bill C-10, where Liberals will seem to stop at nothing to control what Canadians believe, think, and otherwise would have everything, control everything to do with their lives. And Mr. Speaker, my submission to you here today on behalf of so many constituents is to plead with the government to reconsider. You know, as we discuss specifically this bill that has been studied thoroughly, and what I find interesting is now that it is back before this place, with the government's response to a thorough debate that took place in the Senate, we see how so clearly there is not consensus on the path forward for this bill, which is very, very contrary. In fact, Mr. Speaker, I would like to call out a very significant falsehood that is perpetuated often by members of this government. And it is that they somehow suggest, in fact, in question period earlier today, they said very clearly that every Canadian supports this bill, that nobody's opposed to it. What are you Conservatives doing? You stand alone. Well, Mr. Speaker, I will definitively answer that question and say categorically that it is a falsehood, because we have heard throughout the course of this study, and I know for a fact, because there are some members of, there are some Canadians that live in constituencies represented by Liberals, by New Democrats, that have reached out to myself and other colleagues that have said unequivocally that they do not support Bill C-11. And so, Mr. Speaker, I want to call out that falsehood in this place today, because when government ministers, parliamentary secretaries, and other talking heads of the government stand and say, well, it's only the Conservatives. It's only the Conservatives that are somehow opposed to this great idea called C-11. And then they forget to talk about the substance of it, but rather they simply would make the case that everybody is on their side and nobody opposes them. Well, Mr. Speaker, that is categorically false, and I'm going to call that falsehood out here today, like my constituents expect me to. And, Mr. Speaker, as we face a unique circumstance, we are facing not only a censorship bill that is before this place in the form of C-11, but we're facing the limiting of debate. Can you believe it? That we see that not only does the government want to control the online feeds of Canadians, but they are truly stooping to a new level to limit the debate in the People's House of Commons. Mr. Speaker, can you believe it? That the Liberals would, with their coalition partners in the NDP, do everything they can to silence opposition voices, to silence the voices of so many Canadians. And now, Mr. Speaker, it's not just Canadians that we've heard from on this matter. It's not just regular folks that are living about their daily lives. But, Mr. Speaker, we have seen that there is certainly no consensus across the artistic community in Canada. In fact, we have heard from many of Canada's most talented individuals, those in the more traditional spaces like art and writing, and television stars and that sort of thing. But we've also seen, incredibly, the rising digital creator class speak so clearly in opposition to this bill. In fact, I remember this was the previous iteration, Bill C-10. It can get a little a little confusing for those watching, and of which I'm sure there are many watching this egregious attempt by the Liberals to censor not only members of Parliament but all Canadians. The previous iteration of this bill in the last Parliament was called Bill C-10. And I remember chatting with the president of a digital film festival. Now, I can assure you, Mr. Speaker, this was not a natural Conservative. This was not somebody that would be predisposed to vote for the Conservative Party of Canada. But the plea from this pioneer in the creation of digital content was to say, stop it! Stop the Liberals from being able to control our feeds. Stop the Liberals from being able to introduce a massive government bureaucracy that would endeavor to control what you see online. And Mr. Speaker, I am proud to stand in this place with my Conservative colleagues as the only party that stands for freedom and democracy and against censorship. So Mr. Speaker, we do need to kill Bill C-11, no question. You know, and it's interesting because even the Prime Minister's appointed senators brought up concerns about this bill. Yep. Mr. Speaker, again, it's not simply Conservatives that are concerned about cat videos like the member opposite suggested, but it's a growing chorus of folks from across the country that are saying this is not the right direction for our country. And I would note that over the course of the study that took place in Canada's Senate, we heard time and time again, Liberal appointed senators. It wasn't simply Conservatives that were appointed in the Senate. Mr. Speaker, it was a chorus of Liberal appointed senators that they were tired of what the propaganda that the Liberals were trying to sell. And I know that my colleagues have done a great job at unpacking various elements of that here this evening, but certainly when it comes to some of the specifics, we see a number of examples where senators endeavored to make a bad bill a little bit less bad. I think in an earnest attempt for democracy to be able to play its course, and for those voices in the other place, as we refer to it, those senators, including those that the Prime Minister appointed, some of which were artists themselves, ironically. Yep. They endeavored to make this bill less bad. Yep. So, Mr. Speaker, they sent it back, as is tradition and procedure. They sent this bill back. Yet, here we have the government rejecting most of those amendments. Some of the ways that the Liberals would have had the opportunity, a get-out-of-jail-free card, if you will, to address some of the most egregious concerns that certainly Conservatives have highlighted, but also experts from across the country. The Liberals were given an opportunity to say, hey, here from Liberal Prime Minister-appointed individuals, here is how we could have helped you get a pass so that you could have exempted some of the biggest concerns that experts from across the country had brought forward. Yet what does this government do in what Margaret Atwood, again, no Conservative, certainly not a traditional Conservative voter, although we'll see what happens in the next election. Mr. Speaker, we see a creeping totalitarianism where all they want is control, where it seems that they will stop at nothing to control what Canadians see online. Right. Now, Mr. Speaker, let me take a little bit of a step back, if I could, and describe what is so sneaky about this bill. Because we have here not a front assault. You know, you have examples throughout history of direct assaults on freedom of expression. You have numerous examples that one could point to from around the world where government specifically says you can or cannot believe this, although there are many examples where this Prime Minister will certainly call out anything he doesn't like and call it un-Canadian or a fringe minority or those with despicable views or whatever the case is. He's certainly a purveyor of those sorts of divisive and type language that divides Canadians. But, Mr. Speaker, this bill is sneaky. And let me unpack for you why it's so sneaky. Because it doesn't say that a Canadian, a regular Canadian or a content creator or whatever the case is, it doesn't say that you can't post something online, that you can't go onto YouTube or you can't participate in a social media platform of some kind. It doesn't say at all that you cannot post something. That's where it's sneaky. So many people, and certainly there are the members of the Liberal Party have bought into this, because I would hope that they simply don't understand what they are actually promoting and trying to pass into law in this country because of how terrifying of a precedent it sets. But, Mr. Speaker, here's what's really, really terrifying, is because it doesn't at all say that you can't post it. But what it does do is it says very, very clearly that the government can control who sees it. So, Mr. Speaker, as I described this to many constituents who rightly are concerned, we see that it is backdoor censorship at its finest. We see that it's the government using a sneaky mechanism and increased government bureaucracy to endeavor to control what Canadians can see. So in the guise of being able to say, no, we'll never limit what you can say, we'll simply limit what you can see. And Mr. Speaker, it is terrifying that that is something that would be debated in the 21st century in this place. And Mr. Speaker, it is that sneakiness that I would suggest, and I would implore all Canadians, all members of this place, to stand up against that sort of sneaky, creeping totalitarianism. Because, Mr. Speaker, it sets a terrifying precedent that the government can control not necessarily what you say. You're allowed to think and say whatever you like, but they will control who can see it and what you see. And certainly, Mr. Speaker, that is an absolutely terrifying precedent that is being set. So, Mr. Speaker, when it comes to the bureaucracy that has been proposed, now certainly there's many examples where government fails. In fact, I would suggest that government is not really that good at delivering much. And certainly these Liberals have demonstrated time and time again that they're not very good at delivering anything, let alone the promises that they make either during or during a parliament or during an election or whatever the case is. So, Mr. Speaker, the Liberals' response to the mechanism to which they will use to control the information on the internet, the broadcasting, the imposition of broadcasting-like codes into the way that streams and algorithms work online. The way that they're going to do this, Mr. Speaker, is they're going to use a government agency. Now, the government is saying, oh, just trust them. Don't worry about it. There is no reason to be concerned. You can certainly trust anything and everything that a prime minister who has demonstrated himself to be less than truthful on more occasions than he can count. But, Mr. Speaker, we see that they're saying just trust us when the reality is that Canadians can't. And let me unpack that a little bit. By using the CRTC, they are giving a tremendous amount of authority that, albeit arm's length, it's by individuals that are subject to cabinet orders and approval, that are subject to appointments that are made by the governor and council, by the prime minister in essence. Mr. Speaker, we see the fingerprints of the prime minister, again, this backdoor type of censorship that would limit the ability of Canadians, and it gives an incredible amount of authority to a bureaucracy that does not necessarily have the best interests of Canadians in mind. Now, Mr. Speaker, I want to provide a little bit of a paraphrase of part of the debate that I had with the former Minister of Heritage, now the Minister of the Environment, which he certainly has a checkered record when it comes to his activism and whatnot. But when he during the previous debate on Bill C-10, the comment was made surrounding, well, as long as it's the right sort of information, then it must be okay. In fact, I think it was a Green member who no longer sits in this House that had made this assertion during questions and answers, I believe at one late night sitting where, again, the Liberals were trying to force and censor the debate around censorship. But Mr. Speaker, it seemed to be, in the eyes of some within the left, that it was okay to censor as long as it was censoring the views that you didn't like. Now, Mr. Speaker, let me state definitively and uncategorically in this place that freedom is something that cannot be dictated. Freedom is something that exists because people are free. And freedom of speech is something, as is very clearly outlined in our Charter of Rights and Freedoms, is something that requires the full scope of what that means. So, Mr. Speaker, when you have a very clear attempt, when you have a precedent that has been set, when you have examples of both this Prime Minister and other members of the Liberal Party that have demonstrated a willingness to use the authority and the power of government to get their way, to cover up their scandals, to use the massive infrastructure of government and the associated bureaucracy to influence the direction of Canadians. Mr. Speaker, it's something that every Canadian, whether you support the Conservatives or not, because I think this is where, Mr. Speaker, you have a growing number of individuals, and I suspect that directly related with the Liberals' shutdown of debate, their censorship of the censorship discussion, you have a very, very, what I suspect is a growing message is that Liberal MPs, backbench and otherwise, are likely hearing from their constituents that are asking questions. They're saying, so what's the deal with this? So instead of Liberals being honest with those constituents and addressing those concerns and actually taking pause on what would be a massive government overreach, Mr. Speaker, instead, these Liberals are buckling down. They are doubling down and saying, no, instead of being honest, instead of representing their constituents, they will simply slam the door on debate and they will push this through for royal assent so that we can have the control that they so much desire. You see, Mr. Speaker, we've seen this before. And it is incredibly troubling that they are using the heavy hand of their coalition that nobody in either the NDP or the Liberals got elected in. They're using that confidence and supply agreement, a fundamentally undemocratic agreement. They're using that as a weapon to try and control what Canadians can see on the internet. And I will tell you, Mr. Speaker, it's wrong, and it needs to be rejected. And this is what will be the last chance for members of this House to take a stand for Canadians and take a stand for freedom. So, Mr. Speaker, there is so much that can and I believe needs to be talked about when it comes to the myriad of circumstances surrounding Bill C-11. And I would like to, if I could, talk about the idea of Canadian content. You see, it's one of those, as the leader of the opposition very articulately stated earlier, this is one of the sneaky ways that the Liberals are able to massage the debate around this issue to somehow suggest that Conservatives are not the ones that are somehow offside with regular Canadians. Well, Mr. Speaker, the question of Canadian content is so clearly the block that shows that the Liberals are absolutely full of it when they try to hide behind this idea. And let me unpack that a little bit, Mr. Speaker. It would be nice to know what Canadian content is. Yep. It would be nice. And I think that Conservatives, over the course of this debate, we have been asking that very question. Say, okay, give us a definition of what Canadian content is. Yet, the Liberals seem unwilling to have that discussion, let alone meaningfully engage on the issue. So, Mr. Speaker, the question must be asked, why is that significant? Well, because it comes back to who is in control. Because when you are basing a bill on so-called Canadian content, it sounds great. Who doesn't love maple syrup? Who doesn't love being proud to be from Alberta and the Western heritage there? Who wouldn't love to watch the Calgary Stampede for those 10 days during the numerous examples? Country music. You know, not everybody may agree with me on the best form of music, but it certainly is country music. But Mr. Speaker, we see how the Liberals talk about Canadian content, and they are, I think, endeavoring to ensure that the Canadians think of the motherhood and apple pie type messages, the maple syrup, the moose, the fond memories of childhood that's related with the various elements that people may have associated with what they might call Canadian content. You know, Mr. Speaker, what I think is really, really concerning here is because you see a direct attempt for the government to manipulate that term to serve their political purposes. So they're not defining Canadian content in the bill. In fact, Mr. Speaker, if you can believe it, it's not even mentioned. It's not even mentioned in the bill. Not even once. Yet they talk about it in such a forward way that it provides this massive, what I would suggest is almost like a funnel, where they can say, okay, here's the only things that can fit. And what they would determine is the type of Canadian content where they would deem it acceptable. Now, is that coming from a directive from the Prime Minister's office? Well, Mr. Speaker, I don't know. But for the Liberals to suggest that it is or is not comes directly down and back to the question that I asked earlier as to whether or not you can trust them. And I think Canadians increasingly are speaking very clearly on this issue that you cannot. You cannot trust this Prime Minister, you cannot trust this Cabinet, you cannot trust these members of the coalition when they have demonstrated time and time again when they simply cannot be trusted. So, Mr. Speaker, where does this leave us? As we come down to what is literally the end of debate, where we will be once again voting on this bill. The last chance. Well, Mr. Speaker, I think the solution is actually quite simple. Canadians have a choice. Creeping totalitarianism and a respect for a basic dictatorship, or a leader of the opposition, leader of the Conservative Party, who is willing to bring home freedom for every Canadian. So let's bring it home.
Yeah.